Hey there, this video is a short introduction to part 3 of our Starter C++ programming course. And this part of the course covers chapters 6 and 7 in the Gaddis textbook on the subjects of functions and arrays. Now, this part of the course actually represents a pretty big transition point in how our programs are going to be structured. So I would encourage beginning programmers to pay really close attention to these two chapters and think about how much differently your programs are going to look very soon. So what's this about? Larger programs. The overall theme for this part of the course is we're going to be trying to provide some basic tools for dealing with larger programs. Now, to this point in the course, how big have our programs been? Like 20 lines, 30 or 40 lines, something like that? And how much data, how many variables have they used? Maybe 2 or 3 or 4 variables, something like that? And it's important to realize, and this is a perfectly fine starting point, but it's important to realize that professional programs are going to be thousands of lines long. They're going to be possibly millions of lines long. And how many variables are they going to be using? Hundreds or thousands or something like that? I'll say that for my first programming job, I was working on a code base that had 500,000 lines of code, more or less, something like that. And of course, all of our programs in our class have been written by, one student at a time. But in the workplace, you've got fairly large teams of programmers, 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 or 20 or 50 programmers, all working on a single large program, possibly for months or for years at a time. So those are complicated pieces of work. There is no human being who ever lived that can memorize hundreds of thousands of lines of statements and thousands of different variable names and think about how they all interact at once. That is just simply impossible. So in order to deal with larger programs, we have to have tools in our programming languages that allow us to manage that complexity. Ultimately, the real tough job of computer science or software engineering is managing the enormous amount of complexity. Arguably, computer software is the single most complicated thing that people have ever done. And so finding ways to manage that complexity of being able to focus on a fairly small thing at a time is really, really critical. So the two primary strategies that we're going to see in this part of the course are how do you deal with more code? How do you deal with thousands and hundreds of thousands of lines of code? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to split it into very small, isolated subsections that we call functions. And hopefully these functions will only be 6 or 7 or 10 lines long, and they'll only involve 3 or 4 or 5 variables at most. And that's the amount of code that one person can actually hold in their head at once. So being able to focus on that, one little function at a time, that is the subject of chapter 6. And how do you deal with more data? How do you deal with a program that needs hundreds or thousands or millions of data points, variables? Well, the fundamental tool for that is to store it in an array. And it's very, very simple to make a big block of memory that's all one type of variable and one after the other. And then you can just refer to it by what number you want. I want the 10th data point. I want the 100th data point. Very, very simple. So that basic element is called an array, and that's the subject of chapter 7. Now, possibly in later courses, there'll be more sophisticated ways of dealing with all this stuff. But basically in any structured programming language, the fundamental tool for dealing with more code is to split it into separate functions. And the fundamental, most basic way of handling more data is to use arrays to store a lot of data. So really important ideas here. In this course, are we going to be writing programs that are hundreds or thousands of lines long? No, we are not. But we still want to know about these tools because this is what professional programs look like. And if you ever have to deal with a large professional programmer, you need to know what that's going to look like. And all programs are split up into these sections in exactly this way. So a really important part of the course, do not get frozen into thinking that all programs look like what we've done so far. They will be looking quite a bit different very soon, and it's a really important part of the course, and I'm personally excited to deliver that. So when we come back next time, we're going to dig into chapter 6 and learn about how to write our own functions and how to separate our programs into small parts that we can focus on very well and possibly split the work up among multiple programmers in a workplace. And I'll see you then for that.